Ralph Waldo Emerson fundamentally transformed American spirituality by separating it from specific religious traditions so that it could stand on its own. In other words, Emerson was one of the first thinkers, the first philosophers, who considered that human beings have a spiritual nature, and it's possible that our religious ways of being in the world are just ways of trying to interpret or understand or give meaning to this deep spiritual nature that we have as humans. This was such a major shift that the poet Walt Whitman, who was really good friends with Emerson, credited him for expanding and revitalizing the entire concept of spirituality. So again, Emerson saw spirituality as the essence of religion, as something essential to the human being, completely unbound by rigid rituals or doctrines. Those rituals and doctrines are things we place over spiritual core that we're born with. Another cool thing is that there is a lot of modern psychological research that is going into exploring this idea that human beings have a spiritual core to them. In fact, Dr. Lisa Miller from the Teachers College at Columbia University is doing some really groundbreaking thinking, writing, and researching on this very topic. So Emerson was on to something, because scientific evidence exists that proves that human beings have a spiritual core to them. And we will talk way more about this as the class goes on. I just wanted to mention it because it's some really cool stuff that's happening in the scientific world. So this Emersonian transformative thinking about the difference between spirituality and religion was deeply influenced by Romanticism. And Romanticism was a movement that emphasized intuition, personal experience, emotional connection, especially emotional connection to nature. Romanticism was preceded by the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment declared reason, logic, and objectivity to be the highest objectives for humanity. And these ideas really scared the Romantics. For the Romantics, this Enlightenment focus on reason, logic, objectivity was really troubling and very stagnant. Romanticism celebrated the subjective, spiritual dimensions of life, so we can see why Emerson was so fascinated with it. Emerson and the other transcendentalists embraced this worldview completely. And nature and the natural world started to become sources of divine revelation, divine inspiration for living a good human life. Much wisdom was waiting in the natural world to be found. Romanticism also offers really important critiques of the growing materialism and industrialism that was happening during Emerson's time. And Emerson saw that this was really eroding spiritual values, and he warned that the pursuit of wealth was going to overshadow the needs of the soul, calling for a return to a life that's really centered on thinking about spiritual growth, thinking about the importance of ideas, thinking about the human being's harmony with nature and how important that was for us. For Unitarian Universalists today, Emerson's legacy offers a vision of non-sectarian spirituality, which basically means universal. No matter what religious tradition you are pursuing, you are engaged in. As Unitarian Universalists, I think there is so much to draw from Emerson's thinking. Emerson was born in Boston in 1803 to a family with really deep roots in the Unitarian clergy. So Emerson's father was a Unitarian minister, and he died when Emerson was really young, leaving Emerson's mom to raise Emerson and his siblings. So Emerson attended Harvard College at the age of 14, where he was an average student. But although he was just an average student, he developed a really deep interest in philosophy and literature, religion. From there, he decided to follow in his father's footsteps, and he entered the ministry. So Emerson was a Unitarian pastor, a Unitarian minister for 3 years of his life. He began that in 1829, and he was the minister at Boston's Second Church, which you can still visit. Now, although Emerson followed his dad into the ministry, his time in ministry was very short-lived. He had a very tragic thing happen to him. His wife's name was Ellen Tucker, and in 1831, she died. And this was very, very difficult for Emerson. He became increasingly delusioned with traditional religious practices and the institutional church in general. And eventually, in 1832, he resigned from the ministry, citing that he had a lot of discomfort around administering communion, which he felt was really devoid of any true spiritual meaning. So a lot of things had changed for Emerson. even though a lot of things had been changing in his mind and in his heart before Ellen Tucker's death. But this tragic death of Emerson's wife, I think, solidified a lot of the doubts in Emerson's mind about traditional religion, traditional ways of thinking about the divine, traditional theistic ways of the divine acting within people's lives. Emerson eventually seems to embrace a pantheistic view of God, of the divine, of the mystery, which also solidifies a major break from conservative Unitarian theology. So after leaving the church, after leaving his pastorate, something really important and meaningful happens to Emerson. Emerson decides to travel to Europe. And on this trip, he meets some of the most influential writers of the Romantic period. He meets Samuel Taylor Coleridge. He meets Thomas Carlyle. Now, while he is over there, he visits a garden, and he sits down in the garden, and he has a deeply mystical experience, some kind of nature mysticism. Something clicks in Emerson's mind and opens up a whole new way of thinking for him. And that thinking slowly turns into New England transcendentalism. So he returns to the United States. Now, upon returning, he settles in Concord, Massachusetts, and he began to give lectures on spirituality, individualism, nature spirituality, and his really important essay that came out in 1836 called Nature marked the beginning of his rise to fame. And so this positioned Emerson as a leading figure in emerging American philosophy, emerging American transcendentalist philosophy, and the rest is history. And then finally, most importantly, I would really like us to think about how Emerson is still relevant today and how that thinking can inspire us on a daily basis to be faithful, modern, Unitarian Universalists who are passionately active in the world. So there you go, folks. I look forward to this journey with all of you, and I'm going to pass it back to myself. I'll see you in a second.